A moment of silence to random encounters. Once a core part of the JRPG genre has been destroyed by the passage of time, as Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and even Pokémon have left it behind in favour of overworld enemies. But did it need to die? Was it truly such a vile and repulsive mechanic that no RPG that isn't going for a retro aesthetic would include it anymore? In my belief, I don't think it was such a bad system, and some franchises were better off keeping it. For me, what made random encounters so exciting was what I assume many people find so awful: their consistency. Every single RPG was phenomenally paced with random battles that never let the player get bored by exploration. Knowing that I was always just a few seconds away from my next fight kept me engaged while traversing the dungeons. It also meant that dungeons didn't have to be giant sprawling places to get lost in. They could just be a few beautiful rooms with random encounters popping up along the way. Sure, now we have extravagant dungeons for our adventures, but going back to games like the original Final Fantasy VII proved that dungeons could still be visually wondrous without being littered with overworld sprites walking around. The biggest benefit that random encounters had for me was removing the choice of what enemies I had to fight on my journey. I know that must sound strange to most of you, but hear me out. In JRPGs, your level decides everything. You're required to fight enemies on your quest, so you're strong enough to face the boss. A good JRPG will program its encounters to be just frequent enough that the player's strength remains on par with the game as long as they don't run from too many battles. In modern RPGs, the game puts enemies on the overworld for you to fight, and it grinds the game to a halt for me to manually stop every inch and fight each one. I know it's the exact same problem with random encounters, but by hiding the monsters from me, the game felt much faster paced. Add to that how modern JRPGs all have painfully long-winded stories, and it's easy to see why so many modern RPGs drag horrendously. I know what you're thinking. You're not required to fight all those enemies, that's insane, why would you do that? And I ask you, viewer, how am I supposed to know when to stop? These enemies weren't placed here for me to ignore them, so how do I know who to fight and who to skip? I have no way of knowing if I'm at the correct level for the next area until I get there, and then I'll be too weak to train there. Random encounters removed all that hassle for me. I knew that if I wanted to keep on track, all I had to do was keep killing the enemies the game put in front of me, and it didn't make me guess how many enemies I needed to fight. However, I won't pretend that it was sunshine and roses. There are clearly valid criticisms of the mechanic, like overly long intros to battle and the frequency of certain enemy types. I'm looking at you, Zubat. But speaking of Pokemon, I think they're much worse off appearing in the overworld instead of just being hidden in the tall grass. For one, it just looks stupid to have all these wild Pokemon aimlessly wander around waiting for the player to run into them. Very few Pokemon have any sort of behaviour to them, which makes sense because Game Freak are on such a tight schedule that they only have time for the bare essentials, and sometimes not even that. But I'd rather they just save themselves the effort and just keep the Pokemon hidden in the grass. Now, if we can magically get a Pokemon game where each area looks like, of course, a new Pokemon Snap, then yes please 1,000 times to getting rid of random encounters, but for now, having the Pokemon wander aimlessly just looks strange. That's true for all modern RPGs. The monsters are just haphazardly wandering around the overworld and chasing you if you approach them, when it was much more effective for a monster to jump out of literally nowhere and attack you. The problem is that this isn't exactly easy to convey with the realistic art style every game feels like it needs to go for, but that's a whole other can of worms. I suppose it's not exactly cinematic to have the screen turn black to go to a battle screen, which is why only retro-themed games like Octopath Traveler still have random encounters, because there's no immersive way to put a mechanic like that in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I guess it's also nice to not have JRPGs be as stressful anymore, as if you have to go back and buy something in town, it was an ordeal just to get back there, and trekking all the way back to where you were. But didn't that add a sense of danger to your journey, not knowing if you were going to be pounced on at the worst possible moment? Ultimately, I realized that random encounters are a thing of the past, but I don't think that the technology is there yet for all these franchises to abandon it fully. I'd rather my screen just randomly give me enemies than have the overworld cluttered with models aimlessly floating in place for me to take down one by one. and I hope that the mechanic will at least be remembered fondly as time crawls on. I'll be back in 2 days. In the meantime, here's a video about how Blastoise was robbed of his glory.